Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me say how honoured I am to be asked by Margaret to speak to the Lough Rush Historical Society, and it's great to be back here in the Rush Sailing Club, which is an absolutely marvellous venue for a speaker. We've had a great week of commemoration of the Taylor disaster, and what I'll be speaking to you about tonight is another disaster that took place around Dublin Bay, not of the same magnitude, but nevertheless it was a terrible disaster in its own way, and it's one that is remembered very much to this day and commemorated yearly by the lifeboat crews in Kingstown. Now, I originally put the talk together in 1995 for the 100th anniversary of the disaster, which took place in 1895. I think it's very proper that we do commemorate these things and remember them on a regular basis, if for no other reason than to remind ourselves of our own frailty when we set out on the ocean. So in 1895, on Christmas Eve in 1895, the Finnish sailing ship Palme was wrecked in the middle of Dublin Bay in a terrible storm. Now, it gave rise to a terrible tragedy. Now, it wasn't the crew of the Palme that were lost, because all 19 people aboard were subsequently saved, including the captain's wife and baby daughter. This is where the wreck took place, where you see the red dot. But by a very cruel irony of fate, the entire crew of the Kingstown No. 2 lifeboat, the Civil Service No. 7, were all lost. All 15 men were lost when they went out to try to effect a rescue. Now, I'm going to tell you as much as I can about the people who were involved in the rescue, the lifeboat men and various other people. But I also want to tell you something about the ship and the people that were involved in that, because it's always been a very obscure subject until we looked into it and found out a little more about it. Now, I've looked for photographs of the ship, the Palme, and I simply couldn't find any. I'm sure there must be some in existence somewhere. But there are actually two paintings in Dublin that I know about of the ship. One is a copy of the other one. Now, I'll be showing you the original in a moment. The copy is in the possession of Mr. Daniel Gilman in Bray, who's a noted collector of Dunleary memorabilia. And the original was painted by a Liverpool artist called W.H. York. I think I'll probably have to operate this manually. York was a noted marine artist who painted ship portraits in Liverpool during the latter part of the 19th century, and indeed well up into the 20th century. He painted quite a few steamers also. I think the remote control has sat down. And just see, can we get it going here? Now, this is the painting in question, which was owned by the captain of the Palme, Captain Axel Emanuel Viren. And we can fairly date when the painting was done, because inscribed across the bottom is the legend, Palme of Mariehamn, Captain A.E. Viren. Now, Captain Viren only became captain of the Palme in the week preceding the wreck, just when she left Liverpool on her last fateful voyage. So there's a good chance that York painted the portrait of the Palme for Captain Viren on order to be collected when he returned to Liverpool, because I doubt if this portrait of the ship actually survived the wreck. It's in the Olland Schifert Museum in the Åland Islands, up in Mariehamn in the Åland Islands, which is up in the Baltic and is part of Finland. Now, at the time of the wreck, the Palme was owned in the Åland Islands, and she was under the Russian flag, because Finland was then part of the Tsarist Empire. Now, you can see that she's flying the Russian flag, which has recently come back into prominence since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. She was originally an American-built ship. She was built in Boston in 1866 as the Frederick Tudor. And she's a direct link with the great clipper ship era, the clipper ship building era, which lasted up till the time of the American Civil War. This would have been one of the first ships off the stocks after the American Civil War in 1866, and she was built of timber. There were vast resources of timber still available in America, whereas the Taylor, as we saw in earlier lectures, was built of iron nearly more than a decade previously in England. But she was a three-masted, full-rigged ship. During the clipper era, this would probably have been known as a medium clipper. You'll see them referred to, this type of ship, later referred to in various references as a downeaster. But it was as you can see, it was a magnificent looking vessel. And that's actually the Skerries Rock, which figured in the story about the Taylor. A lot of ship portraits from Liverpool would have that in it. I think I'll have to keep walking back and forth. Now, just to move on a little, this and the next slide are extracts from the Register of the Bureau Veritas, which is an organisation similar to the Lloyd's Register, just to give you some details about the ship itself. That's the line in question, Frederick Tudor. 9833 and 11 are classifications for insurance purposes, similar to A1 at Lloyd's, very high classifications. L is significant because it means these are abbreviations from French. Long course, it means that she was deemed suitable for voyages around Cape Horn and the Cape of Good Hope and into the Roaring Forties. The 3M simply means that she was a three-masted full-rig ship, and that's her tonnage there, 1158. To get an idea of what this ship would have looked like, if you're ever in Greenwich and have a look at the Cutty Sark, this ship would have been about the same size in tonnage. And she was rigged almost identically. That simply means that she's an American ship built in 1866 in Boston. The abbreviations that you can see there, C, PP, HK, refer to the materials used in the construction: oak, pitch pine, and hackmatack, which is an American timber that they use for knees and so forth. The other abbreviations means that she was fixed with iron and copper, and that she was sheathed with felt and yellow metal, the last in 1871. Just to give you an idea, it's a very rough sketch to give you an idea of how these type of vessels were built. I've read the specifications of dozens of these type of ships, and they all had one thing in common. They were all extremely well built from massive timbers. All of the main frames and the floors and the footocks and so forth were made of oak, starting off at about up to 21 inches deep on top of the keel and diminishing up to about 12 inches square at the upper side. They had these massive composite oak keels up to about 12 inches wide, all through fastened with inch copper. And the planking was of pitch pine, which is a very hard softwood, sometimes starting at about 7 inches down at the keel and diminishing upwards to about 3 inches. Now, the reason I brought that into the talk is that I firmly believe that it was the salvation of the crew of the Palme when they went aground in Dublin Bay in a terrible storm, the fact that the ship was so well built. Oh, I wonder if I pointed it in this direction, it might work a little better. Let me just see. There we go, I think. Now, this is Frederick Tudor, for whom the ship was named, and he's an extremely interesting character. There's been a book published recently called The Frozen Water Trade, which describes Frederick Tudor's life in great detail, and it's very, very interesting because he was known as the Ice King of America. A marvellous character, and I could give you a lecture about this man. I could talk about him for hours on end. He was just such an interesting character, but he was one of the first great entrepreneurial American businessmen, and he devised the means early in his life of transporting ice from America to the tropics by ship. It seems an incredible trade, but he actually pioneered this and made it work. And in no time at all, a lot of the business, maritime business of Boston, was centered around this ice trade. He devised the means of making the ice, first of all, by creating ponds where the ice was harvested like this with ploughs. It was stored in these warehouses that he had built and then transported in the ships packed in sawdust. And it went from Boston to places like Australia, India, all over South America. And actually, cargoes of ice actually came into Dublin from America also, and from Scandinavia later times. There's a good chance that the people who owned the Palme, or the Frederick Tudor rather, the ship, may have chartered ships to the Tudor Ice Company, because Frederick Tudor never owned any ships in his own lifetime. He used to charter them, and the ship was owned by a firm called Bramhall and Company at the time. That's just a photograph of Frederick Tudor's wife. She was 19 when he married her. He was in his mid-50s, and they had a very large family in quick succession after she initially refused to cooperate with him in the production of children. They went on to have, I think, about 10 in rapid succession. Now, in 1873, the Tudor, or rather Bramhalls, sold the Frederick Tudor to the company of this man here, Johann Dietrich Bischoff of Wegesacken near Bremen. Now, they had a penchant for wooden American-built vessels, and they had quite a fleet of downeasters and clippers, and they were in the business of transporting timber and case oil, which was an early way of transporting petroleum in jerry cans with wooden cases on them. And she sailed very successfully for Bischoff's for a number of years, for about 20 years. In 1893, Bischoff's put the Palme up for sale. Now, it had now become the Palme because she had been named after the first ship that Bischoff's had ever owned, which was a small schooner named the Palme. They put her up for sale, and she was bought by a man called Axel Eriksson from the Åland Islands in Finland. Now, the Åland Islands are a very unique place. They're up in the Gulf of Bothnia in the northern Baltic. It was the home of the last great fleet of commercial sailing ships, which operated well into the 20th century, literally up to the 40s, by this man here, who was a nephew of the man who bought the Palme. This is the great Gustav Eriksson, who operated a fleet of huge, big steel commercial sailing ships right up to the 40s. But at the time the Palme was bought, it was the biggest ship owned in the Åland Islands, and they were only starting to acquire large vessels. Up to that, there were only schooners owned in that part of the world. Now, after an extensive refit in 1895, the Palme loaded a cargo of timber and sailed for Liverpool in England under the command of the owner's son, the man on the left here, Axel Virren. Now, I'll explain that Axel Virren was actually Axel Eriksson's son, but he had a different name because I think there was a degree of nationalism at the time, that the Åland Islands are predominantly Swedish, but yet they're under Finnish ownership. And a lot of people were actually forsaking Swedish names and taking Finnish names. Equally, Eriksson is the most common name in Scandinavia, and I think there was some kind of subvention paid to people to drop the name and take another one for administrative purposes. But this photograph was taken after the wreck took place. It was taken in the Royal Marine Hotel in Kingstown, or what's now Dunleary. And he was only 23 years of age. He had changed places with the captain of the ship, Captain Peterson, who reverted to first mate, and he became the master because he had just achieved his master's foreign-going certificate. That's his wife, Lydia, and his baby daughter, Esther Miranda, who were on board with him and who were all saved. Now, he had been at sea since he was 10 years of age, so he was a fairly seasoned campaigner at this stage, even though he was only 23. Now, the Palme left Liverpool on the 19th to go to Birkenhead to take on ballast, because she had orders to go to Mobile in Alabama to take on a cargo of pitch pine planks. There were no outgoing cargoes available, so she was to sail lightship across the Atlantic under ballast. And on the 19th, just like the Taylor, she was towed down the Mersey, and out towards Anglesey, and the tug let go and cast off, and the ship set sail, intending to sail down the Irish Sea. Now, just a word about the weather conditions in the last month of December in 1895. The weather was horrific. It had been blowing southeasterly, or rather southwesterly, for virtually the beginning of the month, and towards the end of the month, the wind had backed around to southwesterly, and it was blowing a full gale by Christmas week. And as they rounded Anglesey, they ran full force into a southeasterly gale. And by the 23rd, they had only gotten down as far as the Tusker Rock and could simply make no progress further out into the Atlantic or out into George's Channel. They had intended running for Kingstown or Queenstown, which is Cove, for shelter, but instead decided to turn back and run up the Irish Sea. By Christmas Eve morning, they had arrived up off Rockabill here, and the ship at this time had received a dreadful battering. A lot of the sails were blown out and hanging in rags from the yards, and the crew were exhausted, having been on their feet, literally going aloft, changing sails, and so forth for nearly a week. So the captain decided to try and seek shelter in Dublin port. And to that end, they got the vessel around about with great difficulty and started heading towards Dublin port. In the early hours of the morning, they passed the Kish lightship and headed in. Now, the weather shut in very badly. There were rain squalls and a very severe gale was blowing. And they decided then to head for Kingstown. Now, Kingstown Harbour, as you all know, was built as a harbour of refuge for sailing ships in distress. But the Palme was to be denied that. Like so many other vessels, it wasn't always a successful harbour of refuge because it's a very difficult harbour to get in and out of in heavy weather. And at 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve morning, they cast anchor just about here off the mouth of Kingstown Harbour. There are a great many eyewitness accounts of the events that followed, and I'll be quoting from some of those, but apparently there were waves coming over the lighthouse on the east pier here, and the entire bay was a seething mass of foam and spray and high waves as far as the eye could see. Now, they made signals requesting a tow, requesting a tug, and the man who took charge now, who was alerted to the fact that there was a ship off the mouth of the harbour requesting a tow, was the harbour master, Captain the Honourable Francis G. Crofton. Now, he was also the secretary of the Kingstown lifeboat, and he took various steps. The first thing he did was he went to the master of a steam tug that was in Kingstown Harbour and asked him to go out to try and tow the Palme into Kingstown. And the master of the tug took one look out and said no, he couldn't go, that the sea conditions were so bad that he daredn't attempt it. So he next telephoned to the Clyde Shipping Company, which had a couple of tugs in Dublin port, these two vessels here. They were always at the ready in Dublin port. They were a private towing company that existed solely for towing sailing ships in and out of port. And he made a telephone call to the offices of the Clyde Shipping Company requesting that the two tugs here go over and try and tow the Palme into Kingstown or into Dublin port. Now, it'll give you an idea of the sea state at the time when the two tugs ventured down the Liffey. This is the Flying Sprite in the foreground. There were paddle tugs, fairly large, and that's the Flying Swallow. This ship here took a sea down the funnel when they reached the Poolbeg lighthouse, and they could literally go no further. They couldn't get out into Dublin Bay because the sea was so bad, and they had to turn back. The fires were almost extinguished, and she just barely made it back to her berth here at Custom House Quay. So when Captain Crofton, the harbour master, found out that the tugs weren't available, he was also informed that the Palme was now drifting up into Dublin Bay. Now, it's unclear whether or not her anchor cables carried away or whether she was simply dragging her anchors, but at any event, she wound up in the upper reaches of Dublin Bay, virtually opposite Blackrock Baths, directly out in the line between Blackrock Baths and the Poolbeg Lighthouse. So he ordered the signal to be made, summoning the lifeboat men. The maroon rockets were fired. And in all, 23 men arrived down at the old lifeboat house, which is still in existence. It's been refurbished recently, and it now houses the inshore lifeboat, which I believe was paid for largely by the subscriptions of Irish divers. They immediately got one of the boats ready. There were 2 lifeboats on the Kingstown station at that time. The larger one was the number 2 lifeboat, the Civil Service number 7, and the smaller of the 2, which was housed in the old lifeboat house, was the Hannah Pickard. Now, 15 of the lifeboat men were delegated off to kit up and take the Civil Service number 7 out. I had hoped that this was actually a photograph of the Civil Service number 7, because it's very similar to it, and this is Kingstown. This is the Coal Harbour in Kingstown. Excuse me for a moment. But certain features on it lead me to believe that it's the lifeboat that came after the Civil Service number 7, the Dún Laoghaire, the first of the boats that was called Dún Laoghaire. I think there were 3 altogether on the Kingstown Dún Laoghaire station. It's a very similar boat. It was 42 feet long, and it had 2 masts, a main and mizzen, with lug sails, and it also carried a complement of 12 oars. Now, as the men kitted up, just a word about this. Both of the lifeboats on the Kingstown station were designed by this man, George Lennox Watson, who was a very prominent boat and yacht designer. He designed the Royal Yacht Britannia, and they were built to a very high standard. This will just give you an idea of what the sail layout looked like. You had main and mizzen with the 2 lug sails. Now, having only 9 men now to crew the second lifeboat, the harbour master made the decision to send out the 2 lifeboats, because the crew of the Palme were now making signals of distress. They were firing rockets and making various other signals which denoted that they were in distress. He went down aboard in his harbour launch to the guard ship of Kingstown, HMS Melampus, British Navy warship. She was a light cruiser that was stationed permanently in Kingstown. And he requested the captain of the Melampus to provide him with some men to make up the crew of the second lifeboat, the Hannah Pickard. It's said that when volunteers were called for from the crew of the Melampus, that the entire crew stepped forward and volunteered. However, 6 men under George Rogers, who was a petty officer, were detailed off to go with Captain Crofton to man the other lifeboat to make up the crew. Now, they were brought up to the old lifeboat house by the steam pinnace of HMS Melampus, which is probably this vessel here hanging in the davits. And the steam pinnace then towed the Civil Service number 7 down to the mouth of the harbour, where she cast off and set sail in the direction of the Palme. This will just give you an idea of what the lifeboat men of the day would have looked like, the type of gear that they wore. They would have wore oilskin coats and sou'westers, the very heavy cork life belts, and probably would have had leather sea boots also. All very ponderous gear, I would imagine. Now, the Civil Service headed down in the direction of the Palme under sail. By now, a great many people had walked down along the West Pier and were observing events with telescopes and binoculars. A great many people were watching from the shore. The weather conditions, as I said, were absolutely horrific. The larger lifeboat had headed off, and it was followed about 15 minutes later by the Hannah Pickard. There was some confusion as to whether the second lifeboat had actually gone out to aid the first lifeboat or not, but I know for a fact that this decision had been made to send the 2 lifeboats out together. So the Civil Service bore down on the Palme, which by now the crew were starting to cut away the masts in accordance with the instructions for a vessel that had taken the shore to try and alleviate the stress on the hull. The masts were being cut away. As she came down near the vessel, she was seen to round up, probably with the intention of dropping down onto the Palme, and a huge wave struck the lifeboat and overturned her. Now, this was the terrible moment of tragedy, because both of these vessels were designed to be self-righting. And this is the mystery that prevailed then, and it's still a mystery to this day, as to why the large lifeboat didn't right itself. All of the crew were washed out. And I've no doubt in my mind, had the lifeboat righted itself as it was supposed to, that they would have been able to get back aboard and probably have been saved. However, the lifeboat remained upside down, and the crew of the Palme now attempted to become the rescuers by launching a boat, but it was immediately smashed to pieces against the ship's side at the moment that they launched it. This is just a sketch that was done from a little drawing that was taken at the time by an observer, and I think it probably depicts fairly accurately the ship with some of the mast gone, the upturned hull of the Civil Service number 7 here, and the Hannah Pickard, which had followed the other lifeboat out, bearing down on it. Now, the smaller lifeboat, as I said, was about 15 minutes behind the Civil Service number 7, and they took a track slightly inshore of the one taken by the first lifeboat. They hadn't really gone very far when they too were capsized, they overturned, and the men were thrown out of the boat. But unlike her larger sister, the Hannah Pickard managed to right herself, and the men scrambled back aboard. They went a short distance further, and she partially capsized again, throwing some of them into the water. Now, at this stage, they could see the upturned hull of the Civil Service number 7. They could see the wreck of the Palme in the distance. They couldn't see any of the men in the water. They probably weren't close enough for that. They lost the mizzenmast, and they lost about half the complement of oars. And there was nothing the crew of the Hannah Pickard could do now at this stage, only to try and save themselves. To return to Kingstown was out of the question. So they had to head for a part of the shore that afforded them the only bit of shelter along the entire coastline. They put in at a little harbour near Blackrock Baths called Vance's Harbour. Now, that's still there today. You can see it from the Dart if you're passing by. With great difficulty, they got the boat into the little harbour. They were assisted by people on the shore who threw ropes and so forth, and the boat was badly holed. The men were given tickets to go back to Kingstown by the station master. A collection was taken up for them, and they met some of the distraught relatives and friends of the crew of the Civil Service number 7, and they had nothing but bad news to give to them about what had befallen their friends in the other lifeboat. The boat remained in Vance's Harbour here for a number of days, where it was repaired by a team of shipwrights. Now, these are very difficult vessels to fix because they were made with double diagonal planking, and it's a very difficult method of construction in which to carry out a repair. Nevertheless, the boat was repaired, and it eventually returned to station. This is Vance's Harbour today. As you can see, it hasn't changed at all. But I think it's fair to say that at the time, not only would the waves have been coming over the wall of Vance's Harbour because it was a southeasterly gale blowing, but they probably also would have been washing over the railway wall like this, as you see here. That's the very same spot virtually. Now, that's a well-known photograph of the Palme that was taken a few days after when the storm had subsided. And you can see where that's the main mast. The mast had been cut away and had broken off. As I said, that was standard procedure when a vessel took to shore. You can see the very strong poop house here in which the crew took shelter. The main deck house in front of the foremast was actually washed away almost immediately. The crew were only able to get in there at high water, at low water rather. At high water they had to actually come out on deck. That's another photograph of the wreck taken from the seaward. You can see the great bowsprit and the jibboom here, and various pieces of wreckage in the water, probably the masts that had been cut away. You can see here where the main deck house had been and was washed away. It's my understanding that the vessel was visible like this at all stages of the tide up to about 1910. It was stripped away by somebody who bought it. I'll tell you more about that later. And after that, it only appeared at low water. Just to give you an idea of where the ship went aground, it's directly in a line with the two river lights. If you got the two river lights in a line. Now, these were marks given to me by old fishermen who actually trawled the bay. And after you lose the Muglins behind Dunleary Pier, and the marks proved to be incredibly accurate when myself and Roy Stokes went looking for the wreck. We came right on it at the appointed spot, and we got a huge sub-bottom reading. So I reckon there's still a huge amount of this ship there beneath the seabed. I reckon also that we probably got such a big reading because she had been sheathed with yellow metal, which is a type of brass, and that was giving us a bounce. We subsequently dived this day. This vessel was seen putting out of Kingstown Harbour. This was the Irish Lights tender, the Taoireacht, which was based in Kingstown, and she was under the command of Captain Thomas McCombie. The weather at this stage, by Stevens's day, had abated to a great extent. The captain had kept up steam all day Christmas Day, and he attempted to get out into the bay, but he too had to turn back. Now, it's incredible to think of the sea conditions being so bad that a vessel of this size actually had to turn back. So he anchored the Taoireacht about a mile away from where the wreck had occurred. I'm going the wrong way now. That's Captain Thomas McCombie there, a very heroic gentleman indeed. He had been in Irish Lights from the time he was a young lad, and a very experienced seaman. He was the recipient at a previous rescue of the RNLI Silver Medal for a rescue that he had conducted on the North Bull in Dublin Bay, in circumstances very similar to this rescue that he performed now. Now, he brought one of the standard ship's longboats, this vessel here, with his crew, and his 14-year-old son, Leopold Henry McCombie, was with him also on the occasion. And they rowed about a mile to the wreck and back on 2 different occasions and took off all 19 people aboard successfully. On the second trip, they were almost capsized themselves, and there was very nearly being another tragedy. That's another picture of the crew, Captain McCombie there. All of these men, of course, would have been very expert oarsmen. I think it's an art that's slowly being lost to us all. But at that time, they would have been servicing lighthouses, rather, on many occasions by rowing to the landing stages and back. So they would have been very experienced oarsmen. Ironically, the Taoireacht herself was to sink in Kingstown Harbour shortly after. She had broken away from her moorings and she was banging against the wall, and she got holed, and I think she was deliberately scuttled to stop any further damage, and then she was subsequently pumped out and salvaged by Ansers, the Cork salvage firm. Now, almost immediately, Captain McCombie was awarded the RNLI Gold Medal. As I mentioned, he was already the recipient of the RNLI Silver Medal for a rescue that he had conducted in the 1870s to a vessel on the North Bull. But the Lord Mayor's Mansion House Fund, now I'll be telling you more about the funds that were got up in a while, but the Lord Mayor's Mansion House Fund had these medals struck, the Palme medal. You can see it says Palme and 1895 up here, and for valour there. And this was the medal that was awarded to Captain McCombie's son, Leopold Henry. Now, this is presently in Canada, in the possession of McCombie's granddaughter, Miss Tanis Pond from Vancouver. Now, this is the upturned hull of the Civil Service number 7. When it finally came in, it was washed in near Merrion. Now you can see what a fairly massive vessel she was, and the great big rubbing strike around here. These hulls were put in the vessel by the first people who got out to the wreck, or to the upturned boat, some of the DMP men and some of the Coast Guard officers, to see was there anybody trapped underneath. But there was nobody there, and all of the crew had been drowned at this stage. It was thought that these men were carrying a coffin for long enough with this photograph, but further scrutiny determined that that's actually a basket that the man has on his back. He was probably a cockle picker from the bay, and that's one of the Coast Guards there with the stick. There's some slight confusion as to whether the boat returned to service or not, because the service board from the Dunleary lifeboat station, states that this boat was on service till 1898. Yet, the librarian of the RNLI in Poole, in Dorset, Barry Cox, told me that the vessel was broken up on the shore and was never returned to service. Now, that she was broken up would be probably borne out by this small table that's in the possession of the RNLI in Windsor Terrace in headquarters, that was made from a section of the hull of the Civil Service number 7. There's a small brass plate here stating that that's where it came from. And it was bought in an antique shop in Parnell Street a few years ago and presented as a gift to the RNLI. That's just a close-up of that. You can see the plate, but you can get an idea of the double diagonal mahogany planking here with the copper rivets with a layer of oiled calico between. It was probably the best and strongest method of construction for a small boat available at that time. Now, what of the lifeboat men themselves? On the next morning, on Christmas Day, hundreds of people were walking the shore looking for the lifeboat men, and they came across the dismal sight of bodies strewn along the shore. There were 13 bodies recovered on Christmas Day. Some of them were brought to the morgue on London Bridge Road, others were brought to St Michael's Hospital, and an inquest was convened almost immediately. Now, there were a father and son and 2 sets of brothers, and all of the men were quite young except Henry Williams here, who was the ex-coxswain. This is Alexander Williams on the left, who was the coxswain of the lifeboat. He was from Kingstown, and his father Henry before him had been coxswain, and at the time of the tragedy he was the driver, or the pilot rather, of the harbour master's launch. I think Alexander was about 35, and as far as I know his father was about 66 at the time. But he had a very long and meritorious service with the lifeboat in Kingstown, as had Alexander. He'd been involved with it since he was a very young man. Henry's body wasn't recovered for some time later, out off Ireland's Eye, strangely enough. And the body of another man, whom I'll show you now in a moment, was recovered over near the Poolbeg lighthouse. For some reason, those 2 bodies weren't wearing the Cork life jackets. All of the other bodies that came in had their Cork life jackets on them. That's another photograph of Alexander Williams, the coxswain, that was sent to me by his grandson, who now lives near Philadelphia in America. This is one of the sets of brothers, George Saunders. It says Captain Saunders there because he was actually the captain of a steam yacht, a very large steam yacht in Kingstown, I think attached to the Royal St George Yacht Club. His father before him had been a professional yacht captain also. He was married and his wife was pregnant at the time. I've got photographs of 13 of the lifeboat men. There were 15, but I've only got photographs of 13 of them. That's his brother Frank. He was also a professional yacht skipper in Dunleary. I have the names of the yachts that they were skippers of, but I just can't remember them. I just have to refer to my notes now to see that man's name. I haven't given this talk in quite some time, and I just can't remember who's who. Yeah, his name was James Baker, and you can see that he has a yacht jersey there with the name Finola of the Royal Irish Yacht Club there, so there's a good chance. As far as I know, most of these men would have been semi-professional yacht crews at one stage. Virtually all of them were harbour employees, and there were a great many large yachts, schooner yachts and steam yachts in Kingstown at the time, attached to the various yacht clubs, and a lot of them would have had semi-professional crewmen on board. This is Patrick Power, the youngest of the lifeboat men, and single. He was 23. He was unmarried, and he was assistant storekeeper to his brother James in the Royal St George Yacht Club. Apparently he was a very likeable and popular young man. Edward Murphy. He was a crewman of the dredger in Kingstown. He'd only recently got a job as an AB on board the dredger that was stationed in Kingstown Harbour. Now that's Edward Crowe. There's some confusion as to what exactly he did. One report said he was a porter on the Carlisle pier. Another one said that he was a ship's officer. It certainly looks more like a porter's uniform than a ship's officer's one, I think. That's James Ryan. He was also single. He was a harbour boatman. Now, this was another of the pairs of brothers. That's William Dunphy. He was a fisherman. He and his brother were both fishermen. Very humble kind of men, but very experienced seafarers. They lived in one of the little courts off Cumberland Street. Hilton's Court was the name of the place that they lived. The man who preceded him actually was, his body wasn't recovered until some time later over near the Pool Beg. This is Thomas Dunphy. It's a very poor photograph. It was retouched. All of these photographs appeared in a contemporary illustrated magazine called Illustrograph. It didn't last very long as a publication. There were only several issues, but it just coincidentally it occurred at the time of this tragedy. Now that's James Barclay. I think he was also he was a harbour employee of some sort. I'm not altogether sure what exactly he did. And Edward Shannon. I know for a fact that he was a harbour boatman. But a lot of the men were married, and as I said, a lot of them had big families. Alexander Williams had 5 children, and I think Frank Sanders had 6. There were also 2 unborn children who were born after the fact, after the tragedy. Now, the lifeboat men received an enormous public funeral. It was the biggest funeral apparently ever seen in Kingstown, probably from that day to this. And it was paid for by the RNLI. This is a photograph of the Kingstown Town Hall on the morning of the funeral. You can see the crowd starting to gather, and you can see the flag of the Kingstown Commissioners at half-mast over the town hall. The funeral started at the town hall. The men's bodies were taken from some from their homes and some from various churches, and the funeral started off here and proceeded up Marine Road towards Dean's Grange Cemetery. It's not a very clear photograph, this, but you can see the throngs of people, and the procession was preceded by the band of the DMP. The men of the Tairach marched after that, the crew of the Palme, the men from the Melampus, all of the Kingstown fishermen and the Ringsend fishermen marched next. And they proceeded up Marine Road, around into Cumberland Street, into Old Dunleary, and along the sea coast and up towards Dean's Grange Cemetery. And apparently there were throngs of people lining the entire route for the whole distance of the funeral. As they proceeded along the sea coast, they would have been presented with the dismal sight of the wreck of the Palme and the upturned lifeboat on the shore. But there were 13 hearses, each drawn by 4 black horses. And there were very harrowing scenes apparently when the funeral reached Dean's Grange Cemetery. Very, very tragic scenes indeed. The route up to the cemetery gates was lined by sailors from HMS Melampus. Now, in Dean's Grange Cemetery, I don't know about today, but at the time, Protestants are buried in a different part to Catholics. 6 of the crew of the lifeboat were Protestants, and the other 9 were Catholics. Now, the 6 Protestant lifeboat men are buried just on the left as you go in the main gate, and the Catholic ones are buried on the right-hand side of the path, up about 50 or 60 yards. This is the Williams family grave here. Father and son are buried there, although Henry's body wasn't discovered until some time later. There's a little bronze lifeboat on top of that there. The graves adjoining that are those of Henry Underhill, and again I'll have to refer to my notes. Yeah. and Francis MacDonald. Now they were all parishioners of the Mariners' Church in Dunleary. Those are those two graves there. Now, George Sanders and his brother Frank were Methodists, and they're buried quite near to the other four men. You can see that George Sanders' wife, or his widow rather, Susanna, is buried with him there. She lived until 1947. Now, she was pregnant, as I mentioned, at the time, and she had a son who was also called George. Now, he went on to qualify as a medical doctor from Trinity College, and during the First World War, he went out to serve as a medical officer in the trenches, served with great distinction in that regard. After the war, he joined the British Colonial Service and went out to the Gold Coast in West Africa as a colonial medical officer. He retired, I think, in 1960, which would have left him at about 65, I think, and he went back out to do voluntary medical work, and he was killed in a car crash out in the Gold Coast. I don't know what the Gold Coast is called nowadays in West Africa, but he was killed in a car crash just at the beginning of 1961. Susanna Sanders owned a little haberdashery and draper shop beside the Queen's in Dalkey. This is the grave of his brother Frank Sanders. Now you can see here that there's a tragedy combined with a tragedy, because his wife Frances Elizabeth was drowned on the wreck of the Leinster, or rather on the Leinster, when she was torpedoed in the last month of the First World War. Now you might wonder what she was doing crossing the Irish Sea in wartime, but you can see that her daughter is buried with her, who died 3 days later, and I'm informed that her daughter was very ill and she was going over to Holyhead to see her sick daughter. These are the graves of the Catholic lifeboat men. There are 6 of them here, and there are another 3 sort of over behind the trees, just behind those graves. If you read the inscriptions, it mentions a Russian ship named the Palme, and details of the tragedy and so forth. I just want to show you this because this is Thomas Dunphy's grave, and his daughter Sarah Wall died in 1981, and she was 91 years of age when she died. Now she would have been, I think, about 6 at the time the tragedy occurred, and I'm sure she would have had a good memory of it. I actually spoke to people in Ringsend, old people, who remembered all of these events. So it's not really that far removed in time from ourselves, from these present generations. These are some of the harbour yard cottages in Kingstown, which are still there, in which some of the men lived. The Williamses lived here, Edward Shannon, and I think 1 or 2 of the other men also. Now that's the crew of the Palme. There were 17 in all, including one 14-year-old young lad who had stowed away when the vessel left Mariehamn heading for Liverpool. By the time the ship got to Liverpool, he had been incorporated into the crew. They were all brought initially to the Royal Marine Hotel, and then they were accommodated at the Sailors' Rest Home in John Rogerson's Quay. But there's one thing that strikes you about them here, apart from the small numbers, because when the Palme was built, I'm sure she would have had a much larger crew. The Cutty Sark, for instance, had about 28 of a crew. But there were only 17, and I've read various accounts of ships from Mariehamn and other parts of Scandinavia at the time that they were operated at a profit by dint of frugal management. I think sailing ships at that time were largely devoid of the romanticism that is attached to them nowadays, and they hadn't yet become the cult objects that tall ships have become now. But they're all very young, except this man here, whom I think may well have been the first mate, Captain Peterson. There was one Irishman, a man called MacMullen, from a place called Cogery near Belfast. I don't know where that is. There was a German, a Swede, a Norwegian, and the rest of the guys were from the Åland Islands. There were Finns from the Åland Islands. Now this is Leopold Henry Maccombie, Captain Maccombie's son, who was with him at 14 years of age in the rescue boat. You can see him wearing his Palme medal here. That's the uniform of a British colonial officer, because he too joined the British colonial service. And he was serving in Tanganyika in East Africa during the First World War. And he was involved in an action against some Germans. There were Germans in Tanganyika fighting against the British forces. And during an action with some of his native troops, and I quote, he was killed by a crazed native policeman. One of his own men shot him. That's a photograph of Captain McCombie in his old age. He lived to be a great age, I think up to the 1940s. He was from Monkstown. He lived in a house called Laurel Bank in Monkstown. You can see him wearing his gold and silver lifeboat medals here and his British Empire medal. In 1924, all of the surviving recipients of the RNLI gold medal were invited by the King, George V, I think, to Buckingham Palace to receive the British Empire medal. And I think there were 7 in all, 7 or 8, including 2 Irishmen, McCombie and a priest from somewhere in Waterford, who didn't go to the ceremonies for whatever reason, I don't know. This is a silver gilt cup which was awarded to Captain McCombie by the Tsar of Russia. That's in the possession of the McCombie family, who are now living in Vancouver. And these are Captain McCombie's medals, which are also owned by the same family. You can see the two, the RNLI gold and silver, and this is the British Empire medal. I think that preceded the George Cross. I think the George Cross is the medal that's awarded now for civilian acts of bravery. This is just a blow-up of a small ad that occurred in the Irish Times, putting the wreck of the Palme up for sale. Before he left for Finland, Captain McCombie sold the wreck. He put it up for sale, and it was sold to a man called Gaffney from Blackrock, who stripped timber off it and built a lot of barns and outhouses. One of them was only taken down recently in a house called Chesterfield in Blackrock and Cross Avenue. He was given £50 for the wreck. In addition to that, there were about 10 tons of stores had been taken off the vessel and were sold on the quayside. But there are some remains of the Palme to be seen. Now, this is a house called Sandefjord in Ringsend, and it was built by an incredible character called George Prescott. Again, I could talk about him all night because he was a really interesting man, and he lived to be a great age. But in 1896, he built this house called Sandefjord in Ringsend, and he used a lot of the material from the wreck of the Palme in the building of the house. The main stairs in Sandefjord is the companionway from the cabin of the Palme. Beautiful artefact. It's Cuban mahogany newel posts and balustrades, pitch pine threads and strings. And he also used some of the decking, 3-inch pitch pine decking, running from one side of the house to the other to form the upper floors without any joisting. And you can still see some of the caulking that was used in the decking. There was another piece of the mahogany newel post in the Maritime Museum. It was there. Nobody really knew what it was from. But it was known to have come from the Palme, but I reckon it's part of the newel post from the stairs. You can see the nameplate from the Palme also there. That's in the Maritime Museum. This is some panelling around the staircase in Sandefjord that was used. Probably had come from the main cabin. That's the nameplate that was attached to the stern of the Palme, and it's actually it was recycled from the original nameplate, which had Frederick Tudor on it. You can see part of the name of Frederick Tudor on the back of it there incised. There are various other little things, some model lifeboats that were made from timber from the Palme. Those are in the Maritime Museum. And this is the late Robbie Brennan, the manager of the Maritime Museum in Dunleary, showing us one of the Cork life belts that was used by one of the lifeboat men. Captain Viren and his wife in later life. Now, this branch of the Ericsson family didn't really prosper after the wreck of the Palme. This girl here on the left, Esther Miranda, is the little baby that was rescued from the wreck. I don't know how old she would be there, probably about 16 or 17. And by now they had 2 other children. They did actually own another vessel called the Hannah Blanchard afterwards, but Captain McCombie eventually got a job as a customs man with the Russian government on the Finnish mainland, and he wound up his days in Mariehamn working as a builder, and he lived up to about 1940 also. Now this is Adam Finlater, the head of the great Finlater chain of shops. A great man indeed, but he was extremely active in organising a fund, or funds rather, for the dependents of the lifeboat men who had been lost. He was chairman of the Kingstown Commissioners, and literally the next day after the wreck he started to organise a fund for the relief of the dependents. It was generally reckoned, had he decided to enter nationalist politics, that he would have been the new Parnell, but he decided not to. He concentrated instead on local politics, and he was chairman of the Kingstown Commissioners. He also served as foreman of the jury, which was convened. There were actually 3 different inquiries into the loss of the lifeboat men and the lifeboat overturning. There was the inquest itself, there was the RNLI inquiry, and then there was the Board of Trade inquiry. But none of them were able to actually say definitively, this is why the lifeboat didn't right itself. It was a mystery then, and it's a mystery to this day, because tests were carried out on a similar lifeboat down in Cork by a process called parbuckling, which involved wrapping a strop around the lifeboat and tipping it up with a crane. And on each occasion that they did it, the lifeboat in Cork righted itself. So it wasn't known then, and it's never been known to this day. But there were 3 different funds organised for the lifeboat. There was the Kingstown Commissioners Fund, the Lord Mayor's Mansion House Fund, and the Irish Times Fund. All of the contributions were listed in the newspapers of the day, anything from £1 upwards. The largest contribution was made by the RNLI of £2,200. By March, the funds had been combined and they were closed, and there was a total of £17,000 in the bank. Now it doesn't sound like much nowadays, and I don't know by what factor you'd have to multiply it to arrive at present day values. I suppose in the order of about 200 or so. It would leave it being worth a couple of million at least. And I'm informed by Barry Cox, the librarian from Poole, that the widows were being paid almost immediately £1 a week from the fund. I don't know what way the fund was eventually wound up or how it was dispersed. I did hear talk of some acrimony about the disbursement of the fund, but I don't have any great details of that. These type of disaster funds usually wound up the biblical 70 years after the event. Now there's a memorial stone to the lifeboat men in Kingstown, or in Dunleary, near the present lifeboat station, with the inscription on it here, giving the names of the men. It doesn't give you the name of the Palme, just that they went out to save the crew of a wrecked ship. This was part of the George Monument lower down, and when the raised walkway here was built in the 1950s, it was chiselled away and placed at this spot. That's the Mariners' Church in the background there, which now houses the Maritime Museum. Now, every year since 1970, that was the 75th anniversary of the tragedy, the Dunleary lifeboat has gone out to cast a wreath at the site of the wreck. And in 1995, I was very privileged to be invited out to take part in that ceremony. There was a very fine ecumenical prayer service given by Canon Wynne, the father of Stephen Wynne, the lifeboat secretary, and by Father Cassidy from St. Michael's. There's a mention of the wreck of the Palme and the disaster in Ulysses by James Joyce. It mentions that it was an ill-fated Norwegian bark. Now, neither of those things are true, because she was Finnish and she wasn't a bark, she was a full-rigged ship. But it's part of the discourse that takes place between Leopold Bloom and Daedalus and a sailor in this cabman's rest home before their notorious sojourn into Night Town. And I've actually traced that piece of poetry, that piece of verse of distinctive merit that Joyce mentions in the Irish Times, written by Albert William Quill. He was a barrister from Rathgar, and he was fond of writing very high-flown poetry in the style of ancient Greek tragedy about current events. I've collected, I think, in all about 12 different poems and ballads and verses about the wreck of the Palme. It's part of a larger collection that I've made of songs and poems about shipwrecks in Dublin Bay. I think of about 22 altogether. Now, there's a more recent plaque here on the recently refurbished lifeboat house from which the men left. And the inscription on it says, "From this stone boathouse in 1895, 15 brave men from this lifeboat station rowed out to rescue the crew of a wrecked ship. Their boat overturned and they were all drowned. Their memorial is a rough granite stone nearby with their names engraved." Now it concludes with the words, "Their sacrifice is not forgotten." Now I'm full sure, ladies and gentlemen, as long as there are people like yourselves who are fond of the sea, and as long as lifeboat men continue to put out to sea to endeavour to save those whose lives are in peril, that their sacrifice will never be forgotten. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cormac. You gave an excellent talk tonight, and certainly very, very enlightening to all of us, and we appreciate it very much. And like anybody who has any questions to ask, you know, you're very welcome.
Oh yeah, feel free. Yeah.
Right, and thanks very much.
What time of the day did it happen?
Oh yes, I omitted to mention that the Palme appeared off the mouth of Dunleary at about 9 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Eve morning. By 11 o'clock she was aground up in the upper reaches of the bay.
Is there anything at all left of the hole in the sand?
Well, when myself and Roy Stokes went looking for the wreck in 1995, or it may have been 1994, the year before, we were just using an ordinary echo sounder, and as I said, we got a huge reading, a sub-bottom reading. The type of echo sounder that he had gave readings below the seabed as well as above them. Not a lot was showing on the echo sounder. When we eventually dived a couple of weeks later, when the visibility had cleared up, there were bits of timber sticking up. Do you see the stools here? Pieces about that size sticking up out of the sand, that's all. And some, some pieces of iron. But they looked like part of the upper portion of the ship rather than the lower. So I'm convinced that there's a huge amount of the ship still beneath the seabed. Yeah, it went right down into the sand. Yeah. I reckon there probably would, at any stage of the tide, been about at least 4 metres of water. I took into account the height of the tide at the time that she went onto the shore, when she went aground, and it was near high water. So I think that they're probably at the very lowest. Some people are reputed to have been able to walk out to the wreck on very low tides, but I figure that there probably always would have been at least about 12 feet of water there. Yeah.
Was that dive, was that the beginning of your interest in that particular vessel? Or?
No, actually, my interest began in it back in about 1958, when I was 14 in 1958, despite my apparent youth, I might add. We had a small trawler in Ringsend, and we tried our hand at trawling in Dublin Bay, and we got caught in something in the bay. And a subsequent discussion on the quay wall from some very old people who were there, some old men who would have been in their 70s, reckoned that we could only have got caught in the wreck of the Palme. And then they went on to tell the whole story, but some of them remembered it vividly, and some of them had rowed from Ringsend in rowing boats out to take timbers off it. In the mid-60s then, there was a lecture given on the subject in the Maritime Institute, which the talks were then held in Fleet Street, and I attended the lecture in the mid-60s. My father was a member of the Maritime Institute, and I went along and heard the story recounted in detail, and I gave a similar lecture. I gave this talk to the Maritime Institute myself about 30 years later. I don't know whether you're familiar with the south side of Dublin Bay or not. I came across the bay one time in a very, very high-powered, big, powerful, rigid, inflatable boat. It wasn't quite a gale that was blowing, but there's a part of Dublin Bay between Blackrock and the lighthouses where the waves just seem to spill over. They come from deeper water and hit a shallower part, and they literally spill over. Now, given that the waves at the time of this wreck would have been very high, the wind had been blowing southeasterly for nearly a week. Before that, it had been blowing southwesterly. There would have been a lot of fetch in the waves. The tide had slightly turned, so you had wind against tide, and you were in a part of the bay where you frequently get, in high weather, if you look across, there's a big line of breakers across. The time I came across the bay, I was terrified, and we had to go right up into the upper reaches of the bay and crawl our way around by Sea Point and down along the West Pier to get across. I reckon there were freak conditions in Dublin Bay at the time, and virtually no small vessel would have survived there. Oh, indeed they were, and I often wonder where they would have gone had they effected the rescue, had they managed to remain upright and gotten the men off. They wouldn't have been able to make their way back to Kingstown. They probably would have had to make their way up into the shallower confines of the bay and try to get ashore, perhaps on the beach. But I reckon that there were free conditions in the bay at the time. You don't often get easterly weather is a rarity on this coast, thankfully. The prevailing winds on this coast are southwesterly. You don't often get southeasterly weather, but when you do, it tends to be very strong. Anywhere from north around to southeasterly tends to be very high winds and strong winds, and you don't get them very often. There's a saying in lifeboat circles, which I think would have been current then as it is now: drown you may, but go you must. I often wondered why did they go out? And I think the simple answer is they probably felt that they had to go. They certainly weren't doing it for a monetary reward, because occasionally they would have been given a monetary reward, perhaps by ship owners, but it would have been very small. And I've no doubt that the dangers of the sea haven't lessened nowadays. The sea is just as malevolent as ever, and all you can do is try and reduce the danger with modern equipment and motorised lifeboats. But it must have been absolutely horrendous for men in the days of sailing and rowing lifeboats to go out and to be pulling on an oar for hours on end, going to a shipwreck, and then have to head into it on the way back. And I'm always enthralled and amazed by that. And they did it time and time again for literally no monetary reward. I think, and it's a reason why we should remember and commemorate these people. But it was the recommended procedure when a vessel with wooden masts took to shore, particularly a wooden hull vessel, that the masts were cut away.
It must be a terrible thing, all the same, lovely ship, and once you see the mast going, that's the end of the vessel.
Oh yes, but in many cases it would have resulted in the vessel simply grounding and subsequently being salvaged.
All right.
Whereas had the mast been left there, she would have become a total wreck.
Yeah.
Thank you.